Today we have a story about a woman whose name was nearly lost to time, buried in the dusty corners of a small-town archive. Her words, preserved in faded ink, tell of secrets that powerful men tried to erase. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. Ruth Carter kept a boarding house on Marsh Street in the town of Willowfield, Virginia. She was 32 years old in the autumn of 1897. Known for her clean rooms, warm cornbread, and the kindness she showed to travelers passing through. Her hands were always busy, mending, cooking, scrubbing, but her mind was sharp and her heart steady. She had inherited the boarding house from her mother, who had inherited it from her mother before that. The deed was old, written in careful script, signed by a man whose name meant nothing to Ruth until the day Mr. Edmund Fairchild came to call. Mr. Fairchild was the grandson of the town's founding family. He owned the mill, the general store, and half the farmland surrounding Willowfield. He was a tall man with silver hair and eyes like cold river stones. He wore fine suits and carried himself as though the very air owed him deference. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, with two men Ruth did not recognize. They wore dark coats and carried leather cases. Mr. Fairchild removed his hat as he entered, but did not smile. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood, "I've come on a matter of property." Ruth set down the linen she'd been folding. "This house is mine, Mr. Fairchild. The deed is recorded at the courthouse." "Indeed," he replied, "but there are complications. Old debts, historical oversights." He gestured to one of the men, who opened a leather case and produced a stack of yellowed documents. "My family has been reviewing our records. It appears your grandmother's claim to this land was irregular." Ruth felt her heartbeat quicken, but her face remained calm. "My grandmother purchased this property legally in 1860. I have the papers. Purchased from whom?" Mr. Fairchild's smile was thin. "That is the question, Miss Carter. The chain of ownership is unclear. Contested, one might say." He placed the documents on her kitchen table, spreading them like cards in a cruel game. Ruth saw names she recognized. Her grandmother's name, Violet Carter, and above it, another name, Samuel Fairchild. "My grandfather," Mr. Fairchild explained, "owned this land before the war. After certain disruptions, records were lost. Property changed hands in ways that were not always properly documented." His eyes held hers. "I'm sure you understand." Ruth understood perfectly. She understood that powerful men could rewrite history when it suited them. She understood that her family's freedom, hard-won and dearly bought, could be questioned by those who had once claimed to own not just land, but lives. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "Cooperation," Mr. Fairchild said. "I'm willing to allow you to remain here as a tenant. A reasonable rent, of course. All legal and proper." Or he paused, letting the word hang in the air like smoke. "We can settle this matter in court, which would be expensive, lengthy, uncertain." He gathered his papers, tipped his hat, and left her standing in her own kitchen, suddenly feeling as though the floor beneath her feet had turned to water. That night, Ruth could not sleep. She lit a candle and went to the small room at the back of the house, where her grandmother's belongings were stored. Trunks and boxes, old quilts and dishes, and a wooden chest she had never opened. Inside the chest, beneath layers of fabric, she found a leather-bound book. The pages were brittle, the handwriting cramped and hurried. It was a ledger of some kind, filled with names and dates and numbers. And at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in oilcloth, was another document, older than the deed, older than anything Ruth had ever seen. It was a bill of sale, but the name written there made her blood turn cold. Not because she didn't recognize it, but because she did. The name was Eliza. And in the margin, written in different ink, were 7 small marks, 7 crosses, and beside them, one word, Justice. Ruth closed the ledger and sat in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around her, and wondered what truths had been buried here, and what price her family had paid to keep them hidden. Ruth woke before dawn, as she always did. The boarding house demanded early rising fires to be lit, breakfast to be prepared, rooms to be readied. But this morning, her hands moved through familiar tasks, while her mind turned over the mystery of the ledger and the bill of sale she had found. The name, Eliza, appeared 17 times in the old ledger. Each entry was brief, dates of work, assignments given, rations distributed, but there was no surname, just Eliza. and those 7 crosses in the margin, stark and deliberate. She had 3 boarders that week: an older gentleman traveling to Richmond, a schoolteacher waiting for the term to begin, and a young man who worked at Mr. Fairchild's mill. They ate her biscuits and eggs in comfortable silence, and Ruth poured coffee with steady hands, though her thoughts were elsewhere. After breakfast, she walked to the courthouse. It was a brick building at the center of town, impressive in the way such buildings always were, columns and carved lintels, meant to suggest permanence and authority. The clerk was a thin man named Mr. Wesley, who had held his position for 20 years. He looked up from his desk with the expression of someone interrupted from important work. "Miss Carter," he said, without warmth, "what brings you here?" "I'd like to see the deed records for my property," Ruth said. "The boarding house on Marsh Street." Mr. Wesley's mouth tightened. "Those records are being reviewed." "Reviewed? By whom?" "By Mr. Fairchild's attorneys." At his request, he returned his attention to the papers before him. "The documents are not available for public viewing at this time." "But it's my property," Ruth said, keeping her voice level. "Surely I have a right to see the deed that bears my family's name." "The matter is under legal examination," Mr. Wesley replied, not looking up. "You'll be notified when the review is complete. Good day, Miss Carter." She stood there a moment longer, feeling the weight of dismissal. This was how power worked in Willowfield, not with raised voices or violence, but with polite words and closed doors. She turned and left without another word. On her way home, she passed the mill where half the townsmen worked. The great wheel turned in the river, constant and rhythmic, and Ruth could hear the clatter of machinery through the open windows. The young man who boarded with her, Joseph, was somewhere inside, breathing lint and dust for 12 hours a day, earning barely enough to afford a rented room. When she reached home, she found a notice tacked to her front door. It was printed on official paper, stamped with the county seal. The language was dense and formal, but the meaning was clear. Mr. Fairchild's attorneys were filing a claim of disputed ownership. Ruth had 30 days to respond. If she failed to do so, the property would revert to the Fairchild estate. She pulled the notice from the door and went inside. Her hands were shaking now, though whether from anger or fear, she could not say. That evening, after her boarders had retired, Ruth returned to the wooden chest. She studied the old ledger more carefully, reading each entry by candlelight. The handwriting was meticulous, the work of someone who understood that records were power, that what was written down became truth. And then she noticed something she had missed before. At the back of the ledger, tucked between the final pages, was a loose sheet of paper. The writing was different, hasty, uneven, as though written in darkness or in haste. It was a list of names, 7 names, all of them men, and beside each name, a single word, overseer. Below the list, in that same hurried script, was a date, July 4th, 1830-7. And below that, 2 lines. They thought her simple, they were wrong. The reckoning came in silence, and when morning broke, 7 men lay dead, and Eliza was gone. Ruth sat very still, the paper trembling in her hand. She read the words again, and again. Eliza was gone. But if Eliza had fled, vanished into the night after killing 7 men, how had this ledger come to be in her grandmother's possession? How had the boarding house been built on land once owned by the Fairchild family? She looked at the bill of sale again, studying it more closely. It was dated 1868, 3 years after the war ended. The seller was listed as the estate of Samuel Fairchild. The buyer was Violet Carter, but there was something else. A notation at the bottom, in cramped legal script, settlement of outstanding obligation, not a purchase. A settlement, as though a debt had been paid. Ruth blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, listening to the house creak and settle. Somewhere above her, floorboards groaned as one of the boarders shifted in sleep. Outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent, and Ruth thought about a woman named Eliza, who had lived 60 years ago in this same town, under the control of men who believed they owned her. A woman who had killed 7 overseers in one night, and survived. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with something else, something colder and more certain. If Eliza had found a way to claim justice from men who believed themselves untouchable, then perhaps there was a way forward for Ruth Carter as well. But she would have to be careful, patient, and above all, she would have to understand what had really happened on that night 60 years ago, and why Mr. Fairchild was so determined to take back this land now. The following Sunday, Ruth attended service at the Methodist Church on Oak Street. It was a modest building, white-painted and plain, where the town's black families gathered to worship. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, was a gentle man who spoke of mercy and endurance, and Ruth had always found comfort in his words. But this morning, as she sat in her usual pew, she noticed something different. Mr. Fairchild was there. He rarely attended this church. His family worshipped at the Episcopal congregation on the hill, but today he sat in the back row, his presence filling the small room like cold fog. Several people glanced his way, then quickly looked down. Ruth kept her eyes forward, but she felt his gaze on the back of her neck. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the sunlight, Reverend Thomas touched Ruth's arm. A word, "Miss Carter." They stood in the shade of the oak tree that gave the street its name. The Reverend's face was troubled. "Mr. Fairchild has made a generous offer to the church," he said quietly. "He wishes to fund repairs to the roof and purchase new hymns. He's also offered to pay for a new bell." Ruth waited. "He mentioned you during our conversation," the Reverend continued. "He said there's been some misunderstanding about your property. He wanted me to know that he bears you no ill will, that he only wishes to correct historical errors." "And what did you tell him?" Ruth asked. Reverend Thomas looked pained. "I told him I would pray on it. Miss Carter, He hesitated. "Be careful. Mr. Fairchild is a powerful man, and powerful men do not like to be challenged." Ruth nodded slowly. The message was clear. Even here, in this space that should have been sanctuary, Fairchild's influence reached. That afternoon, Joseph, the young man who worked at the mill, knocked on her door. His face was drawn, and he held his cap in nervous hands. "Miss Carter," he said, "I need to speak with you, privately." She led him to the kitchen and poured him coffee. He drank it in one long swallow, then set the cup down with shaking hands. "There's talk at the mill," he said, "about you, about your house." "What kind of talk?" "Mr. Fairchild's foreman, Mr. Crane, he told the workers that you're trying to cheat the Fairchild family, that your grandmother stole the land after the war, that you're dishonest." Joseph's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some of the men believed him. They're saying you shouldn't be allowed to keep boarders, that it's not proper." Ruth felt her stomach tighten. This was how it began, not with law or violence, but with whispers. Reputation destroyed quietly, brick by brick. "Is there more?" she asked. Joseph nodded. "I was in the foreman's office yesterday, delivering a report. I saw papers on his desk, property maps, old ones, and there was a letter from Mr. Fairchild's attorney. I only saw a few words before Mr. Crane covered it, but he swallowed. It mentioned your grandmother's name, and another name, Eliza, and something about a blood debt." The room seemed to tilt. "Blood debt? Thank you for telling me," Ruth said quietly. "Miss Carter," Joseph said, his young face earnest, "my grandmother worked for the Fairchild family. Before the war, she never spoke of it, but my mother said she had scars. That something terrible happened there." He stood, twisting his cap. "Whatever Mr. Fairchild is trying to do, it's not just about land. There's something else, something he doesn't want people to know." After Joseph left, Ruth returned to the wooden chest. She spread out the ledger, the bill of sale, and that loose sheet with the 7 names. She studied them by the late afternoon light, trying to piece together a story from fragments. 7 overseers dead in one night, a woman named Eliza who vanished, and 60 years later, her grandmother, Violet, purchasing land from the Fairchild estate as settlement of outstanding obligation, not payment. Settlement, as though a debt had been owed. That night, Ruth could not sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house around her, and the darkness seemed full of whispers. She thought of Eliza, moving through some long-ago night, carrying out an act so bold and terrible that 7 men died. Had she acted alone? Had she been caught? How had she survived? And why did Mr. Fairchild want this land so badly now, 6 decades after the blood was spilled? Ruth rose and lit a candle. She went to the small writing desk in her room and took out paper and pen. If powerful men could rewrite history with documents and legal claims, then she would fight with the only weapons she had, the truth. Carefully recorded, she began to write. "My name is Ruth Carter. I am 32 years old. This house is mine, bought with my grandmother's money and courage. If anyone reads this and I am gone, know that I did not surrender. Know that I stood my ground, and know that I am not the first woman in my family to fight for what is mine." As she wrote, the candle flame wavered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, Ruth thought she heard footsteps on the porch. She set down her pen and listened. Silence. But when she went to the window and looked out, she saw a figure standing in the street, a man in a dark coat, watching the house. He stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. Ruth stayed at the window until he was gone. Then she locked every door and returned to her writing, because she understood now that the fight had truly begun, and she would need to be ready. The following week brought rain. It fell steady and cold, turning the streets to mud and keeping Ruth's boarders inside. She served them hot soup and cornbread, kept the fires burning, and tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy, even as dread settled deeper into her bones. On Thursday morning, Mr. Fairchild returned. This time he was not alone. He brought Mr. Crane, his foreman from the mill, and a man Ruth did not recognize, a lawyer, by the look of his fine clothes and leather satchel. "Miss Carter," Mr. Fairchild said, water dripping from his hat brim. "May we come in?" Ruth stepped aside. They entered her parlor, tracking mud across her clean floor, and she said nothing. She had learned that silence was sometimes the strongest response. The lawyer opened his satchel and removed a stack of papers. "Miss Carter, I am Mr. Pemberton, representing the Fairchild estate. We have completed our review of the property records." He laid the documents on her table. Ruth saw maps, deeds, old census records, and pages dense with legal language. "The conclusion is clear," Mr. Pemberton continued. "Your grandmother's purchase of this property in 1868 was based on fraudulent documentation. The land was never legally transferred from the Fairchild estate. Therefore, it remains the property of my client." Ruth's voice was steady. "My grandmother paid for this land. I have the receipt of sale." "A receipt issued under false pretenses," Mr. Fairchild said smoothly. "My grandfather was in poor health at the time. His affairs were managed by others who took advantage of the chaos after the war. They had no authority to sell family land." "Then take it to court," Ruth said. "Let a judge decide." Mr. Fairchild's smile was cold. "Oh, we will. But I thought I'd give you one final opportunity to settle this reasonably. Sign over the deed now, and I'll pay you a fair price for the improvements you've made to the property. You can relocate with enough money to start fresh elsewhere." "How much?" Ruth asked, though she already knew the answer would be an insult. $200. The number hung in the air. $200 for a property worth 10 times that, for the house her grandmother had built with her own hands, board by board, for the legacy meant to ensure that her family would never be at anyone's mercy again. "No," Ruth said, but Mr. Crane spoke for the first time, his voice rough. "Miss Carter, you should think carefully. A woman, alone, running a boarding house. Accidents happen. Fires, structural collapses. It would be a shame if something happened to this old building." The threat was clear, barely veiled. Ruth looked at each man in turn, memorizing their faces. "Get out of my house," she said quietly. Mr. Fairchild's expression hardened. "Very well. You'll be hearing from the court, and Miss Carter, I'd advise your boarders to find other accommodations. People won't want to stay in a house with such uncertain prospects." They left, and Ruth stood alone in her parlor, trembling with rage and fear. Through the window, she watched them climb into a carriage and drive away, wheels cutting deep ruts in the muddy street. That night, 2 of her boarders gave notice. The schoolteacher apologized, saying she'd heard troubling rumors and thought it best to move to a more established boarding house. The older gentleman simply paid what he owed and left without explanation. Only Joseph remained. "I'm not leaving," he said when Ruth asked if he'd heard the rumors. "Whatever they're saying about you, Miss Carter, I don't believe it, and I think you need someone here, someone who can bear witness." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you, Joseph." After he'd gone to his room, Ruth returned to the wooden chest. She read through the ledger again, more carefully this time, looking for details she might have missed. And she found something. A notation on the page dated July 3rd, 1837, the day before the 7 overseers died. It was written in the margin in tiny script. Eliza questioned regarding missing supplies, confined to quarters, to be disciplined at dawn. Ruth's breath caught. Disciplined. She knew what that word meant in the context of slavery. She'd heard the stories from her grandmother, spoken in hushed tones, whipping, branding, worse. But Eliza had not waited for dawn. Ruth turned to the loose page with the 7 names. She studied them, and then she did something she hadn't thought to do before. She went to the small bookshelf where she kept her grandmother's Bible. Inside the Bible's front cover, her grandmother had written the family tree. Ruth traced the names back. Violet Carter, born 1842. Mother, Eliza, no surname given. No birth date. Just Eliza. Free 1865. Free in 1865, when the war ended. But the note in the ledger said Eliza was gone in 18th. How could she have been freed 28 years later if she'd vanished after killing 7 men? Unless she hadn't vanished. Unless she'd been caught. Unless. Ruth's hands began to shake. She went to the bill of sale again and read the notation at the bottom. Settlement of outstanding obligation. What if the obligation wasn't money? What if it was something else? What if Eliza had been held all those years, and the land, this land, had been the price of her silence? The price of keeping buried what had really happened that night. Ruth sat in the darkness, her mind racing. If that was true, then Mr. Fairchild wasn't just trying to reclaim property, he was trying to erase evidence, to bury the truth once more. Outside, the rain fell harder, and in the distance, Ruth heard the church bell toll midnight. She thought of Eliza, confined to quarters, awaiting punishment at dawn. She thought of 7 men who believed they held power over her, who slept soundly that night, never suspecting what was coming, and she thought of what it must have taken for Eliza to do what she did. The courage, the rage, the terrible, perfect justice of it. Ruth rose and went to her desk. She took out fresh paper and began to write, documenting everything she knew, everything she'd found. If Mr. Fairchild wanted to bury the truth, she would make sure it couldn't be buried. She would make sure that Eliza's story and her own would survive. Morning came grey and cold. Ruth had barely slept, but she rose and made breakfast for Joseph. Moving through the familiar routine with mechanical precision, her mind was already working, planning, searching for a way forward. After Joseph left for the mill, Ruth put on her best dress and walked to the office of Mr. Harold Jenkins, the only black attorney in Willowfield. His office was above the grocery on Main Street, 2 small rooms that smelled of paper and pipe tobacco. Mr. Jenkins was a careful man in his 50s, known for his thoroughness and his quiet persistence. He listened as Ruth explained her situation, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "May I see the documents?" he asked. Ruth showed him everything. The deed, the bill of sale, the ledger, the loose page with the 7 names. Mr. Jenkins studied them in silence for a long time. "Miss Carter," he finally said, "this is more complicated than a simple property dispute. I know, if what you suspect is true, if Eliza killed those 7 men and was somehow held accountable, and if this land was transferred as part of some settlement, then there are records, official records. They would have to exist, even if they're buried deep. Where would they be? The county courthouse has records going back to before the war, but not everything survived. Some records were destroyed, some were relocated." He met her eyes, "and some were deliberately hidden. Can you help me find them?" Mr. Jenkins set down the documents and folded his hands. "I can try, but Miss Carter, you need to understand what you're up against. The Fairchild family has controlled this county for 3 generations. Edmund Fairchild sits on the county board. His brother is a judge in Richmond. His cousin is the sheriff. I know, and you still want to fight this." Ruth thought of Eliza, alone in some dark room 60 years ago, knowing that dawn would bring pain and humiliation, and perhaps death. Eliza hadn't backed down. She'd acted. "Yes," Ruth said, "I want to fight." Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to be smart, and we'll need evidence that's irrefutable. I'll start searching the county records, but there's somewhere else you might look. Where? The old Fairchild plantation. It's been abandoned since Samuel Fairchild died, but the buildings are still standing. If there are records from before the war, personal records, plantation journals, correspondence, they might still be there." Ruth felt her pulse quicken. "How would I get in?" "The property is posted. No trespassing." "But..." Mr. Jenkins paused. "The overseer's house at the edge of the property has been empty for decades. The door locks were broken years ago. If someone were to look there, in the overseer's quarters, they might find old logs, punishment records, bills of sale." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. That Sunday, Ruth told Joseph she needed his help. They waited until late afternoon, when the autumn sun was already sinking toward the hills. The old Fairchild plantation was 3 miles outside town, down a rutted road that few people traveled anymore. The main house stood like a monument to decay, its columns cracked, its windows broken. But the overseer's house, a smaller building behind the main structure, was intact. If weathered. Joseph kept watch while Ruth pushed open the door. The smell hit her first. Mold and rot and time. The interior was a single large room with a fireplace at one end and the ruins of furniture scattered throughout. Rats had nested in the corners. The floor was littered with fallen plaster and leaves blown in through broken windows. But against the far wall, Ruth saw what she'd hoped to find. A wooden cabinet, its doors hanging open, filled with old books and papers. She worked quickly, pulling out ledgers and journals, checking dates. Most were ruined by water and insects. But near the back, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a leather-bound book labeled Plantation Records, 1835 to 1840. Her hands shook as she opened it. The entries were methodical, tracking everything: crops planted and harvested, supplies purchased, punishments administered. And there, on page after page, were the names of enslaved people, ages, descriptions, work assignments. Ruth found Eliza's name on a page dated 1836. Eliza, age uncertain, approximately 16, house servant, quiet disposition, literate to be corrected. Literate Eliza could read and write. That detail caught Ruth like a hook. A teenage girl who could read, in a world designed to keep her ignorant and powerless. Ruth turned pages, following Eliza's story through brief, cold entries, and then she found it. July 3, 1837. Eliza discovered with forbidden materials, books, writing implements, confined, severe discipline ordered for dawn, 4th of July. And on the next page, dated July 5, 7 overseers found dead, Eliza missing, search parties dispatched, property loss, 7 men, value approximately $6,000, 1 enslaved person, value approximately $800. The cold calculation of it made Ruth sick. Men valued in dollars, a girl's life measured in currency. But there was more. An entry dated July 10. Eliza captured near the river, held for questioning. She hadn't escaped. She'd been caught. Ruth's heart raced as she turned more pages. The entries became sparse, as though whoever kept the records wanted to document as little as possible. But on a page dated August 1, 1837, she found a single line: matter resolved, per agreement. Eliza remanded 2 quarters. No further action. No trial. No execution. No further action. Just, per agreement. Miss Carter. Joseph's voice, urgent. Someone's coming. Ruth grabbed the ledger and ran. She and Joseph fled through the overgrown fields, ducking behind a stone wall just as a carriage appeared on the road. Through gaps in the stones, Ruth saw Mr. Fairchild himself, accompanied by 2 men. They went into the main plantation house and emerged minutes later. Ruth and Joseph waited until the carriage was gone, then made their way back to town by a different route, avoiding the main road. That night, by candlelight, Ruth read the entire ledger, and near the very end, she found what she'd been searching for: a letter, tucked between the pages, dated 1860-8. It was from Samuel Fairchild to Violet Carter, Madame, in consideration of services rendered and silence maintained regarding events of July 1830, and in recognition of the passing of Eliza in April of this year, I hereby transfer ownership of the property known as Marsh Street parcel to your name, free and clear. This transfer serves as settlement, in full, of all obligations between the Fairchild estate and your family. This matter is to be considered closed. The relevant records have been sealed as Fairchild. Ruth read it 3 times. Eliza hadn't vanished. She'd been held for 31 years, held in silence, until she died in 80, and only then had the Fairchild family paid their debt, with land, blood, and silence, purchased with earth and timber. Ruth carefully copied the letter by hand, word for word. Then she hid the original ledger beneath a loose floorboard in her room and took the copy to Mr. Jenkins first thing the next morning. He read it with growing astonishment. "This changes everything. This proves your grandmother's claim was legitimate. But Miss Carter," he looked up, "this also proves what happened to Eliza and what the Fairchild family did. They kept her enslaved even after she should have been freed," Ruth said. "They held her in silence for 3 decades to hide what those overseers had done to her, to hide what she did to them. If this becomes public, then let it become public. Let everyone know what kind of family has controlled this county for 100 years. Mr. Jenkins was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll file this with the court. But Miss Carter, be prepared. Edmund Fairchild will fight this with everything he has. He won't just be fighting for land. He'll be fighting to keep his family's secrets buried. Let him fight, Ruth said. I'm ready. The petition was filed on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, all of Willowfield knew about it. Mr. Jenkins had been strategic. He didn't just file a response to Mr. Fairchild's claim. He filed a counterclaim, asserting that Ruth's deed was valid and that the Fairchild family had obtained the property through illegal means before the war, and he attached copies of the letter and relevant ledger entries as evidence. The courthouse was required to make such filings available for public review. By Tuesday, the newspaper had picked up the story. The Willowfield Gazette ran it on the front page. Property dispute reveals dark plantation history. The article was careful, written in the neutral language of journalism, but it laid out the facts. 7 overseers dead in 1837, an enslaved woman accused, a mysterious settlement 30 years later involving land transfer. The town erupted in whispers. Ruth kept her head down and her doors locked. Joseph reported that the mill was buzzing with talk. Some people defended the Fairchild family, calling the accusations outrageous. Others were silent, thoughtful, remembering old stories their own grandparents had told. On Wednesday, Mr. Fairchild's attorney filed a motion to have the documents excluded from evidence, claiming they were obtained illegally. Mr. Jenkins countered that the documents had been found on abandoned property and were legitimate historical records. The judge scheduled a hearing for Friday. That Wednesday night, someone threw a rock through Ruth's front window. She found it in her parlor, wrapped in a note that said, "Drop this, or face consequences." She showed the rock and note to Joseph, who wanted to go to the sheriff. Ruth shook her head. "The sheriff is Fairchild's cousin. He won't help us." Thursday morning brought unexpected support. Reverend Thomas came to her door, his face grave but determined. "Miss Carter," he said, "I've been praying on this matter, and I've been speaking with members of the congregation. We want you to know that we stand with you." "Reverend, I don't want to bring trouble to the church." "The trouble was already there," he said firmly. "It's been there for 60 years, buried and festering. Sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to open it to the light." That afternoon, 12 members of the Methodist congregation signed a letter of support for Ruth, which Mr. Jenkins filed with the court. It stated that they believed her claim was just, and that the truth about the Fairchild plantation needed to be acknowledged. Edmund Fairchild responded by withdrawing his offer to fund the church repairs. Reverend Thomas shrugged when he heard. "We'll fix our own roof," he said. "We always have." Thursday evening, Ruth was sweeping broken glass from her parlor floor when she heard a carriage stop outside. She looked through the broken window and saw a woman descending from an expensive coach. The woman was perhaps 60 years old, dressed in black silk, her gray hair pinned severely. She walked to Ruth's door and knocked with the head of her cane. Ruth opened the door cautiously. "Miss Carter," the woman said, "my name is Margaret Pemberton. I am the widow of Judge Pemberton, who served this county for 30 years before his death." Ruth recognized the name. Judge Pemberton had been respected, known for fairness. "May I come in?" Margaret Pemberton asked. Ruth led her to the kitchen and offered tea. The widow accepted, settling into a chair with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "I've read the filings in your case," she said, without preamble. "I've seen the letter and the ledger entries." Ruth waited, uncertain where this was going. "My late husband," Margaret continued, "kept private journals. He recorded cases he'd overseen, but also matters that troubled him, things he wished he could have addressed but lacked the power or evidence to pursue." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small leather journal. "After he died, I read them all, and I found this." She opened the journal to a marked page and slid it across the table to Ruth. The entry was dated 1880, written in careful script. "Today, Edmund Fairchild, grandson of Samuel, came to my chambers seeking advice on a family matter. He spoke of land transferred to a colored woman after the war, suggesting the transfer had been irregular. He wanted to know if there was a way to reclaim the property. I told him I would need to see the deed and supporting documents before advising. He declined, saying he would handle it privately. His visit troubled me. I have heard whispers over the years about the old Fairchild plantation, about things that happened there before the war, about agreements made and silences bought. If Edmund is trying to undo such an agreement now, it suggests that whatever was buried is still dangerous to his family's reputation. I've made a note of our conversation in case it should ever matter." Ruth looked up at Margaret Pemberton, hardly daring to breathe. My husband couldn't act on suspicions alone, Margaret said, but you have evidence, real evidence, and I want you to know that if there is any way I can help you present this case, I will do so. Why? Ruth asked. Why would you help me against one of the most powerful families in the county? Margaret's expression hardened. Because my husband believed in justice, and because I am tired of watching powerful men bury the truth to protect their reputations. The Fairchild family has controlled this county long enough. She stood, gathering her things. The hearing is tomorrow. I will be there, and I will speak if needed. After she left, Ruth sat alone in her kitchen, the journal entry before her. The net was tightening around Edmund Fairchild. The truth was coming to light, despite his efforts to keep it buried. But Ruth knew that cornered men were dangerous, and Edmund Fairchild was very dangerous indeed. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her chair by the broken window, watching the street, waiting for whatever might come, and in the darkness, she thought of Eliza, held in silence for 31 years, never free, even after the war that was supposed to free everyone. Ruth would not be silent. She would speak for Eliza, for her grandmother Violet, for every woman who had been forced to swallow truth and rage to survive. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, she would speak. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread through Willowfield like wildfire, and everyone wanted to witness the hearing. Ruth arrived early with Mr. Jenkins, but still they had to push through a crowd to reach the entrance. Inside, the courtroom hummed with whispered conversations. Ruth saw faces both familiar and strange, members of her congregation, workers from the mill, shopkeepers, farmers from the surrounding county. In the back rows sat reporters from newspapers as far away as Richmond. Edmund Fairchild sat at the front with his attorney, Mr. Pemberton, and 2 other men in expensive suits. He did not look at Ruth as she entered. The judge was the Honorable Mr. William Crawford, brought in from the next county specifically for this case because of the conflict of interest with local judges. He was a stern-looking man with white whiskers and sharp eyes. "Order," he said, though the room was already quieting. "This is a hearing to consider motions filed in the matter of Fairchild versus Carter regarding disputed property ownership. Mr. Pemberton, you may present your motion." Fairchild's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we move to exclude from evidence certain documents which the defendant has submitted. These documents were obtained through trespassing on private property and therefore should not be admissible." Mr. Jenkins rose. "Your Honor, the documents in question were found in an abandoned structure on property, posted for no trespassing but not actively secured or maintained. Furthermore, these are historical records of significant public interest regarding crimes committed and subsequent cover-ups. The public interest in truth far outweighs any property claim." "The property is clearly posted," Mr. Pemberton argued. "The defendant had no right to enter. The defendant was searching for documentation to defend her legitimate ownership of property being wrongfully claimed by the Fairchild family." Mr. Jenkins countered. "She was exercising her right to defend herself against a fraudulent claim." Judge Crawford held up a hand. "I've reviewed the documents. Before I rule on their admissibility, I want to hear testimony. Mr. Jenkins, call your first witness." "I call Miss Ruth Carter to testify." Ruth stood and walked to the witness chair. Her legs felt unsteady, but she kept her head high. After she was sworn in, Mr. Jenkins began his questions. "Miss Carter, how did you come to own the property on Marsh Street?" "I inherited it from my mother, who inherited it from her mother, Violet Carter." "And how did Violet Carter acquire the property?" "She purchased it in 1868 from the estate of Samuel Fairchild." "Do you have proof of this purchase?" Ruth nodded. Mr. Jenkins presented the deed and bill of sale, which were entered into evidence. "Now, Miss Carter, what prompted you to investigate the history of this property?" Ruth explained how Edmund Fairchild had visited her, claiming irregularities in the original transfer, how she'd found her grandmother's wooden chest, how she'd discovered the ledger and the letter from Samuel Fairchild, and what did that letter reveal? Ruth took a breath. This was the moment. It revealed that the property wasn't sold. It was transferred as payment, as settlement of an obligation. What obligation? The obligation to keep silent about what happened in July of 1837, when a 16-year-old enslaved girl named Eliza killed 7 overseers who had been tasked with punishing her the next morning. The courtroom erupted. Judge Crawford's gavel rang out like gunfire. "Order! I will have order." When the room quieted, Mr. Jenkins continued. "And what evidence do you have of these events?" Ruth described finding the plantation ledger, The entries documenting Eliza's confinement and the discovery of the 7 dead overseers. The notation that Eliza had been captured and the matter resolved per agreement. And what happened to Eliza after this agreement? Ruth's voice was steady. Though her heart ached, she was kept enslaved. Even after the war ended in 1865, she was held by the Fairchild family. She died in 1868, still in their custody. Only after her death did Samuel Fairchild transfer the property to my grandmother as settlement. So, your grandmother was related to Eliza. Eliza was my great-grandmother. She was my grandmother Violet's mother. The whispers started again. Judge Crawford didn't bother to silence them this time. Mr. Pemberton rose for cross-examination. Miss Carter, you claim to have found this ledger in an abandoned building on the old Fairchild plantation. Isn't it true that you were trespassing? I was searching for the truth. That's not what I asked. Were you trespassing on posted property? I entered an unlocked building on abandoned land to find evidence related to my family's history. So yes, you were trespassing. And you expect this court to accept documents you obtained illegally? Mr. Jenkins stood. Objection. The witness has been badgered on this point. The question of admissibility is for Your Honor to decide. Sit in. Judge Crawford said. Move on, Mr. Pemberton. Miss Carter. Isn't it convenient that you just happened to find these documents right when you needed them to counter my client's legitimate claim? There's nothing convenient about learning that. My great-grandmother was tortured and imprisoned by your client's family. You have no proof that she was tortured. She killed 7 men rather than face what they planned to do to her at dawn, Ruth said, her voice rising. What does that tell you about what she expected? The courtroom was silent now. Everything was on Ruth's. And then she was held for 31 years, Ruth continued. 31 years after she should have been free, held in silence because the Fairchild family needed to hide what their overseers had done, what they had all done. Objection. Mr. Pemberton's face was red. The witness is making inflammatory accusations without foundation. I have the foundation right here, Ruth said, pulling the copied letter from her pocket. Samuel Fairchild's own words. In consideration of services rendered and silence maintained regarding events of July 8 to 37, he bought her silence with land. He bought my grandmother's silence, and now his grandson wants to take back what was paid for in blood and suffering. Miss Carter, Judge Crawford began, but Ruth wasn't finished. Eliza was 16 years old. She could read and write, which was forbidden. When they found out, they locked her up and planned to beat her, or worse, at dawn. So she fought back. She did what she had to do to survive. And for that, she spent the rest of her life in chains, even after the war that was supposed to free everyone. Ruth's voice broke, but she pushed on. This land is mine because it was bought with my great-grandmother's silence and suffering. Because the Fairchild family knew what they'd done was monstrous, and they paid to keep it buried. And I will not let them take it back. I will not let them bury the truth again. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Then from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Slowly at first, then others joined. Not everyone. Some sat in stony disapproval, but enough that the sound filled the high-ceilinged room like thunder. Judge Crawford banged his gavel. Order. This is a court of law, not a theater. But Ruth saw his eyes, and she saw something there that looked like respect. Edmund Fairchild stood suddenly. Your Honor, I wish to speak. Judge Crawford looked surprised. Mr. Fairchild, you are not a witness, nevertheless. I wish to address the court. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but keep it brief. Fairchild walked to the center of the room. He did not look at Ruth. His face was composed, but Ruth could see a vein pulsing in his temple. Your Honor, Miss Carter has made serious accusations against my family based on documents of questionable provenance. My grandfather was a respected member of this community. The suggestion that he would have held someone in unlawful bondage after the war is absurd. He then explained the letter. Mr. Jenkins said, explain silence maintained regarding events of July 1837. I cannot explain a document I have never seen before today, Fairchild said. For all we know, it could be a forgery. It's not a forgery, a voice said from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. Margaret Pemberton stood, leaning on her cane. I recognize my late husband's handwriting on the copy of the journal entry that has been submitted. He recorded Edmund Fairchild coming to him in 1889, asking about reclaiming this very property. Why would he want to reclaim it if his family had no knowledge of the circumstances? Fairchild's face went pale. That's a private conversation. Nothing is private when it pertains to justice, Margaret said firmly. She looked at the judge. Your Honor, I have known the Fairchild family my entire life, and I have heard the whispers. We all have. About the old plantation. About things that happened there. This is the first time anyone has had the courage to bring evidence to light. I urge you not to let that evidence be suppressed. Judge Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. I will take a brief recess to consider the motions. Court will reconvene in 1 hour. The room emptied slowly. Ruth stayed in her seat, suddenly exhausted. Joseph appeared at her side, bringing her water. Mr. Jenkins was speaking with other attorneys, but he caught her eye and nodded. When court reconvened, Judge Crawford's expression was grave. I have considered the motions regarding admissibility of evidence, he said. While the manner in which some documents were obtained is irregular, I find that they are authentic historical records of significant public interest. The letter from Samuel Fairchild clearly indicates an agreement related to the property in question. Therefore, I am denying the motion to exclude. Fairchild's attorney stood. Your Honor, we strenuously object. Your objection is noted. Furthermore, Judge Crawford continued, based on the evidence presented, I find that Violet Carter's purchase of the property in 1868 was legitimate and binding. The deed is valid. The current claim by the Fairchild estate is without merit and is hereby dismissed. The courtroom erupted again, this time in cheers from some and angry mutters from others. Order. Crawford banged his gavel. I'm not finished. This court also finds that the historical record presented here reveals deeply troubling practices by the Fairchild family, both before and after the Civil War. I am directing the county to open an investigation into these matters and to make public any relevant historical records. Edmund Fairchild stood rigid, his face like stone. Case dismissed, Judge Crawford said. Miss Carter, the property remains yours. Ruth felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. Mr. Jenkins squeezed her shoulder. Joseph was grinning, and as Ruth walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun, she thought of Eliza, a 16-year-old girl who had refused to accept the punishment planned for her, who had fought back with everything she had. Eliza had survived, though not in the way she deserved. She had been held in silence for 3 decades, but that silence was broken now. The truth was out, and Ruth had won. Winter came to Willowfield, that year with unusual gentleness. The first snows fell soft and clean, covering the town in white silence. Ruth kept her boarding house. Her business grew. In fact, as word spread about the trial, people came from neighboring counties to meet the woman who had stood up to the Fairchild family and won. Some came to rent rooms. Others came simply to hear the story firsthand. Edmund Fairchild left Willowfield in December. He sold the mill and the general store and moved to Richmond. The town whispered about his departure. Some said he'd been pressured by business associates who didn't want to be associated with the scandal. Others said he simply couldn't bear to stay in a place where everyone now knew his family's secrets. Ruth didn't care why he left. She was just glad he was gone. The county investigation that Judge Crawford had ordered uncovered more records from the old Fairchild plantation. They were assembled into a report and made available at the courthouse for anyone who wished to read them. The documents told a grim story of cruelty and exploitation that had been carefully hidden for decades. Several historians came to Willowfield to study the records. One of them, a professor from the university in Charlottesville, asked to interview Ruth about Eliza. Your great-grandmother's story is remarkable, the professor said. An act of resistance on that scale, by an enslaved woman, and then her survival afterward. It's extraordinary. I'd like to write about it, with your permission. Ruth considered. Will you tell the truth? All of it. Not just what's comfortable. I'll tell what the records show, the professor promised. And I'll make sure Eliza's name is remembered. Then, yes, Ruth said, tell her story. The Methodist Church on Oak Street got a new roof that spring. The congregation raised the money themselves, through suppers and donations and determined effort. Reverend Thomas said it was the finest roof the church had ever had, made stronger by being built with their own hands. Joseph saved enough money to leave the mill and apprentice with a carpenter in Richmond. Before he left, he came to say goodbye to Ruth. You changed this town, Miss Carter, he said. You showed people that the truth matters, that standing up to power is possible. I just did what needed doing, Ruth said. Same as Eliza did. "That's what makes it matter," Joseph replied. Margaret Pemberton became a regular visitor to Ruth's boarding house. She and Ruth would sit in the parlor on Sunday afternoons, drinking tea and talking about the town, about justice, about the long work of healing old wounds. "My husband would have been proud of you," Margaret said one afternoon. "He always believed that the law should serve justice, not just power." "I wish I could have met him," Ruth said. "I think you would have liked each other. You've both understood that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it costs you." On the anniversary of the trial, Ruth took flowers to the small cemetery behind the Methodist church. She'd placed a marker there, a simple stone with an inscription: "Eliza, born in bondage, died in silence, but her truth lives on." Ruth knelt beside the marker and spoke quietly, as though her great-grandmother could hear her across the years. "I kept my promise," she said. "I didn't let them bury you again. People know what happened now. They know what you did and why you did it. They know what was done to you." The winter wind stirred the bare branches overhead. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter. "I hope you found peace," she whispered. "Wherever you are now, I hope you know that. You're free. Finally, truly free." She stayed there a long time, in the cold and the silence, thinking about courage and resistance and the long shadow that history casts. When she finally rose to leave, she felt lighter somehow, as though a burden she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. Ruth walked back to her boarding house through the quiet streets of Willowfield. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children played in the snow. Life continued, ordinary and precious. Inside her house, Ruth lit the lamps and started a fire in the kitchen stove. She had bread to bake and rooms to prepare. Boarders would arrive tomorrow, and the work would begin again. But tonight, she took out paper and pen. She had been keeping a record of everything that had happened, writing it down in careful detail. Not for lawyers or judges or historians, but for the future, for the women who would come after her. She wrote, "My name is Ruth Carter. This is the story of how I fought for my home and won. But more than that, it is the story of Eliza, who fought for her life and her dignity in a world determined to deny her both. I tell this story so that no one forgets what was done and what it cost to survive. I tell it so that when future generations ask whether justice is possible, whether one person can stand against power and win, the answer will be yes. It is possible. It is hard. It will cost you, but it is possible. And sometimes the truth is worth any price." Ruth set down her pen and looked at the words she'd written. They would endure, she hoped, long after she was gone, long after everyone who remembered this fight had passed. The words would remain. She thought of Eliza again, that 16-year-old girl who had refused to submit, who had fought back with desperate courage, who had survived decades of captivity but never truly surrendered. "Thank you," Ruth whispered to the empty room. "Thank you for showing me how to be strong." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the town in white. And in her boarding house on Marsh Street, Ruth Carter sat by the fire, keeping watch over the home that was hers, the home that had been bought with blood and silence and suffering, the home that was now, finally, free. From the Willowfield County Archives, the case of Fairchild v. Carter concluded in December 1897 with dismissal of the plaintiff's claim. The property known as the Marsh Street boarding house remained in the possession of Miss Ruth Carter until her death in 1932, at which time it passed to her daughter. The county investigation into historical practices at the Fairchild plantation resulted in numerous historical records being made public and contributed to a broader understanding of the period. The story of Eliza, though incomplete in its details, has been preserved in several academic works and local histories. Her grave marker remains in the cemetery of the Oak Street Methodist Church, visited by those who wish to remember that even in the darkest times, resistance is possible and truth, eventually, prevails.